Dan Küykendall is an industry leader in AppSec for 25 years, with a total of 30 years in tech. He was the co-founder and CEO of NT Objectives until acquired by Rapid7 in 2015, where he served as Senior Director of Application Security Products until 2023. Dan currently works on advising startup leaders and teaching software development leadership. He recently started incubation on a new startup. Dan joins us to unpack why all application security products suck. Spoiler alert, he doesn't really think they're all terrible, but you need to listen to hear what he really thinks. We hope you enjoyed this conversation with Dan Küykendall.
How do you create security champions? Security Journey brings together two powerful approaches to provide application security education to help developers become security champions and produce safer applications. Security Journey training content extends beyond developers to reach the entire SDLC, creating a security-first organization. Learn more about our enterprise security training at securityjourney.com.
Hey folks, welcome to another episode of the Application Security Podcast. This is Chris Romeo. I am CEO of Kerr Ventures and a stealth startup, and also co-host of said podcast. Always super excited to be joined by my good friend, Robert Hurlbut. Hey, Robert.
Hey, Chris. Yeah, Robert Hurlbut, Principal Application Security Architect and Threat Modeling Lead at Acquia. And like you, excited to be here as well and talking about our topics today.
Yeah, we got a special guest who's been doing a show talking about AppSec over the last number of months. Dan Küykendall is joining us here. But Dan, we always like to jump in with no warm up for our guests, literally throw you into the fire with your security origin story. How did you get started in this crazy world of application security?
Yeah, well, good to be joining you, Chris and Robert. So thanks for having me on here. Origin story. Geez, I was fascinated with tech through like high school. So this is like in the late 80s, right? Early 90s. I was kind of, junior high and high school. We had some computer classes. I was always fascinated. But I was a poor kid growing up. So didn't have access really to much in the way of computer technology until later. I had a roommate in one of my first apartments that had a computer and let me kind of just tear it apart on a regular basis and rebuild it. And so I learned a bunch. This is back in the day of BBSs, right? So before the internet. And so I was getting on this local BBS, and the admin of it, I offered to help. Like, I'll just vacuum, right? Like whatever I can do and it just to learn. Show me, right? And so he was helping me. So I kind of got on as like a moderator to the BBS. And then there was an online gaming system or gaming environment called the Sierra Network or the Imagination Network. And so there was a game on there that this game is Zerbius that I loved playing, but this is back when you'd pay, I think, was it by the hour or something? By the minute? I don't forget. I think it was by the hour. And that would be a very expensive endeavor to grow your character. And so there was another player on the BBS with me that was actually like an actual developer. And so we were talking about like, oh, this sucks, having to spend so much money to build up your character. And he had kind of been looking at it, and he had me run some tools because he was running tools on his machine to see how the system worked. And we basically found that our character stats were saved on a file on the computer that could just be manipulated. And so he created something called Vitamin F, and you could boost your character. And that just blew my mind, right? Like, oh, it's on here. Like, it just trusts me to like not manipulate that file or not have the skill to. So that kind of really opened my eyes to the security space. And that's really, everything else was kind of born out of that. I ended up at a job at UCLA, got as like an IT, like I was AV guy. I was like setting up microphones and projectors for these professors that were going out and teaching schools. And so I ended up next to the Unix admin at the university. They stuck me in the Library and Information Services building. High school dropout, had no reason to be in there. But this guy, the IT admin of the university, was really kind and would share stuff with me constantly. So I was learning as the internet was coming out. And so everything was just demystified, right? And I still didn't understand it until there was a tool, a program. We were trying to take the BBS to the internet. We were bridging it. It was like a Wildcat server. And so we had done a bunch of stuff. I was using Linux to like do the DNS, and I was starting to use SendMail. And then I stumbled on Qmail. Is it Qmail? I think that's what it was. Yeah, Qmail. And the way that Dan, I think it was Bernstein, I think that was his name, that was creator of it. The way he was building it and the way he created each separate piece to not trust the other, like why? Like, how's this happen? So I actually, I started convincing, I wasn't really much of a developer yet, but I started convincing him that I would, how can I help you? I basically found developers hated writing docs. So I actually got my start in the Linux community writing help docs. And in return for them answering my questions, I would write their their man pages, right? And detail everything out. And so when I started seeing how Dan was doing things, I was like, well, that's fascinating. This is why is he doing it? Blew my mind. And then the next step of oh, yeah, the other systems aren't doing it, and here's the problems, right? And so I started digging in. And so I did some open source work for a while. It was cool. I was a speaker at the first open source conference in San Diego, right? That the O'Reilly publisher put on. And that was cool. Got to meet a bunch of people, and that demystified things as well, because it was everybody was a bunch of smucks trying to figure this out. And I think that's one of the things that a lot of people go into this space and they're intimidated by, oh, there must be super smart people building all these things. No, just smucks, just like the rest of us, just happened to be writing that piece of code. And so as I started learning, reading code, I just kind of fell in love with the problem space. And so Kevin Mitnick's story, during that, him being arrested and all that, because I was hacking my neighbors at that point. It was when cable modems came out and you were still on the same LAN with everybody, right? Mm-hmm. Before they really natted everybody, right? And so watching the saga with Kevin was interesting. So then it kind of put me on I better find somebody that will actually let me pay me to do this, so I can do it under the veil of legitimacy. And so started kind of following along and got attached to some interesting teams, ended up at Foundstone, and worked on the FoundScan product. And that was a crazy place to be back then, because we had some of the best researchers out there, right? It was really, if you go back into that space, there's generally At Stake or Foundstone, right? You come from one of those two worlds, right? And in Foundstone, you bundle EI and all those kind of, whatever. But so I came from the Foundstone legacy, and I just actually ended up there not even knowing what they were. I was I wanted to get into development, so I applied for a PHP developer job, right? And they're like, "Do you know who we are?" I'm like, "No idea." And ended up being Foundstone. I was felt like God kept leading me into every next step. It was just amazing. So that's how I ended up in it. Ended up separating from Foundstone to build NTO. And I was really fascinated by the web security side of things. So that's where I've really spent my time since 2002, is purely on AppSec.
Yeah, it's such a good story. And, you're from the same vintage as Robert and I. And so, of course, you've aged a lot better. Just for those watching on YouTube, you've aged far better than either Robert or I have. But yeah, you're making me, I've had a lot of guests recently that have just been making me nostalgic. And you said Wildcat BBS. Trying to bring it onto the internet. I was a BBS guy back in that same time frame. And so I learned a lot from BBSs and running a BBS and that type of stuff. Just it's a great foundational layer as a starting point to tech that just it's gone by the wayside. I don't think any exists anymore, but I need to look it up and see if there's still one I could dial into just to see if I could hear that sound when that modem would be, you get that sound, and we can all hear it in our heads that lived it. Anybody that's born after, the year 2000 is like, I don't know what you're talking about. The internet does not make sounds when you connect to it, but we lived it. We did it. So you mentioned Kevin Mitnick.
Connecting to it is almost absurd. It's always there.
Yeah. And then, it's just, it was such a different world we grew up in as technology people. You mentioned Kevin Mitnick, and I know you did a video recently about how you were able to teach AppSec to Kevin Mitnick. And, with Kevin Mitnick passing a number of weeks ago, I thought I'd just love to hear that story firsthand right here from you.
Yeah. Well, as I mentioned, I had been following his journey in 2600, right? And so super aware of him, and felt bad for the way he was being persecuted, right? And he did things wrong and whatever, but and I don't think he ever said he wasn't doing something he shouldn't be, but the punishment I don't think fit the crime, and so anyway, I kind of lost track of it. We're running NTO at this point. We kind of had launched it and had launched our NTO Spider product at that point, and our sales guy, I was kind of a key man. So I was kind of doing a little bit of everything, right? If you're a startup founder, you kind of know what that's like. And you're just doing everything. I was looking at the sales emails, and one of them came in and it said it was from Kevin Mitnick, right? Kevin at Mitnick Security or whatever it was. And I was like, okay, what's this? So I'm like, hey, Carl, I'll answer that email. And so I emailed him back, and sure enough, it was the actual Kevin Mitnick. And so I was like, I guess I was probably awestruck at that point, right? And like, wow, this is crazy. And so he wanted a copy of the product, and I kind of knew he was out of jail at this point, and I think he was under supervision, or he's just kind of finally getting out of his supervised release. And so he was telling me that he's trying to get up to speed on web security, or, at the time it was web security, right? He's trying to get up to speed on web security. That stuff really didn't exist when he went in, right? That wasn't really a field yet. And so he'd really missed out on a lot. And I just thought that was fascinating. So I offered him, like, hey, if you ever want some help, if you ever want me to show you anything, I'd be happy to. And you say that to a lot of people, and usually they don't take you up on it, especially didn't think he would. But he's like, absolutely. If you want to help me, I would love to. So we ended up setting up sessions to sit down in the evenings and just go over stuff. So a couple days a week for a couple months, we would sit down and I would teach him another AppSec thing, right? Another web security thing. Start off with SQL and then cross-site scripting, and really the fundamentals of why how those happen, right? Not just the payloads, but the understanding. And he was really quick learner, and very curious and very humble. It was a neat experience I didn't expect, right? And we just became friends. Just would chit chat. We'd keep in touch. Me and my wife would go meet him in LA for dinner whenever he was around, or not all the time, but when he would come in and out, and we would go hang out. He had health issues throughout the years, and he ended up moving out to Vegas, or staying in Vegas because of his mom and taking care of her. And he was just there's the persona, but just when you're with him, and I think I started, watching LinkedIn and watching some stories after he passed, you would see that. But when he was here, it just was this persona. And some people would make fun of him, and some people were inspired by him. But to me, he was such a cool guy, and just really chill, humble, and very curious. He always was asking the next question. There's that the five whys, I think, for that is what they call it in the lean startup or whatever, yeah. Right? Is 5 whys. That was Kevin. He was always okay, why? Answer that. Well, why does that happen? Because he was always I don't know, the 5-year-old that you're constantly answering the next question.
It's a good level of curiosity, though, right?
Yeah.
And it's a good reminder that everybody in our industry, there's people behind here, because there's far too often in my career of watching what was information security. And then as I moved into AppSec, it's like, I guess anytime you have groups of people, you have some amount of drama, but I've never been one. Like life's too short for drama, but like it's a good reminder. Like you're telling these stories that are showing that Kevin Mitnick was just a regular guy. Like, and if people, who had feelings and cared for people and did these things, it's a good reminder for all of us that like we're just people. We're just a collection of people. There's really nothing special about any of us that are in the AppSec community. Like, oh yes, you might get to speak at a conference. Woohoo! That doesn't make you any better or anything than anybody else. Like, I've been around I think I'm 26 years in cybersecurity, and I'm not even amazed by the things that I can learn every day. And that's why Robert and I started doing this podcast, because we wanted to ask people questions and learn and continue to grow in our knowledge of this, because there is no such thing as an expert. I don't care what anybody says. Like, there are no experts. If you really want to go to court and prove you're an expert, you'll get beat because somebody will make a case about what is this? Well, then how does that work? Oh, you don't know that? You're not an expert. Sorry. So that was my soapbox moment about people in security. So Robert, what did you want to ask next?
Yeah. So you mentioned Foundstone. I remember that. That's a name I haven't heard in a long time, and their products. But you have a series that you put together, Why All AppSec Products Suck. And can you explain the motivation behind that series, as well as what prompted you to create it and the content?
Yeah, and I apologize. We got lawnmower, of course. So now I'm no longer at Rapid7, but while I had actually put together this talk. I've done conference talks throughout the years, right? I'm always when you're doing a conference talk, anybody that's done this, you're trying to like come up with your hook, right? And you're trying to make something interesting. And so I had been putting together kind of a comparison of the different tools. And as it is my normal want, I'm going to try to figure out an angle to make it kind of fun, right? And so I kind of came up with this idea of why all AppSec products suck. And then I kind of restructured my conversation around that. And my goal was like, even though I'm selling it, I was selling a DAST, right? That's been our primary product. And then we acquired a RASP technology. And so we were kind of selling that too. But my natural inclination when I'm dealing with customers is that I hate being like salesy about my product. I would rather try to be like a trusted advisor. Like tell me what's going on in your org. What are your problems? And then let me see if I can help solve it. And some of the solution may be our product, and sometimes it wasn't, right? And I would have conversations where I'm like, this is not what you need right now. You need a SAST, for instance, or whatever, right? And so over the years, I'm always looking at all the new technologies, all the new trends, and keeping up with what's going on. And I felt like people don't always people have a conversation from a vendor that tells why their product category is so awesome and better than the other ones, right? And so my inclination is to be a counter to that, right? And so that's just my natural inclination. So came up with the idea of like going through every product category and writing out the strengths and weaknesses. And it's not about actually, and if you watch the videos, it's not necessarily, or the conference talk, it's not about entirely beating up on it. But if you don't understand the limitations of a given tool, if you don't understand its strengths and weaknesses and really understand both of those, you're not going to pick the right tools. And also the idea that one tool is going to like solve be your solution, that's nonsense. You need a collection of tools that work on the different things that they actually can help with. And so that's been the overall premise of the series. And it was a lot of fun. I took the conference talk itself, and if you kind of watch the videos, you see the evolution of it. What happened is I did the conference talk, and the very first time I did it, it was kind of fun because Jeff Williams was in the room. And so like, I've known Jeff, been around, been in the industry for a long time, right? So we all know each other. And so it was funny. My wife actually happened to be sitting in on the conference. she'd come with me because it was in Santa Monica on the beach. And so she was hanging out with me. And so I started kind of like, and I knew that when I saw Jeff, like, I'm going to have to engage with him throughout this. Right. And so I was kind of calling him out, and we had a good, he was like bantering back and forth. And I looked at like our family chat later, and my wife's like, "Oh, your dad has a heckler," because she didn't understand, she didn't know context. Right. And so like, as I got to the I asked part and the strengths and weaknesses of the I asked, he's like, "Well, that's not true," or "That's not fair." And so it was good. It was fun. And I enjoyed that. It was a blast. So when I left Rapid7, I was like, okay, I wanted to start some YouTube. I wanted to start some doing my own content. And my focus, really, my goal is to be focused on dev leadership. That's something I'm very passionate about, on like leading software engineering teams in particular. There's lots of leadership stuff. There's lots of engineering project kind of management, but like leadership, I don't see a ton of that content out there. And so that's really the goal of my channel. That's why it's called Dan on Dev and not like AppSec Dan or anything like that. But I had this content, and I'm like, hey, what if I cut this up into pieces so I could practice getting stuff on YouTube, right? And just practice the editing process, and it kind of like grew way beyond what I thought. And the conversation was awesome. The engagement on LinkedIn in particular, it was a lot of fun. Yeah, it was just a breakdown. It was just taking my conference talk into separate pieces and zeroing in on each product category episode by episode.
Okay, so I'm gonna come at this from a different angle now that I've heard you kind of describe what your series is. Okay, so we're gonna parachute Dan into a startup company. Okay. And so you don't have unlimited resources. You're not one of those startup companies. You didn't get a $500 million Series A check attached to you. So you have some constraints on money. You can't just write blank checks everywhere, but you have money to spend. What are your top priorities from an AppSec tooling perspective in prioritized order? So what would you do first? And give us a couple of those categories, then give us some rationale for what the benefit would be for that company, for that small startup.
Yeah, that's a good question. I would probably focus on figuring out the most efficient way to spend on training content for your engineers. Because if you can solve some of the issues, like especially if you're that early, that's where you have to solve things. That's where you design in security. And so if you're really spending time designing security into the product, a lot of the other stuff won't happen, right? It won't be a thing. So it would be a lot more about taking time than actually spending, I think. Taking the time to sit down and talk through design, talk through the security implications, make sure that, you may have some like hotshot young developer. Does he know anything about security and the implications of his design choices? Or is he just picking up a toolkit and, knocking out a quick UI and all that sort of like, it would be a lot. I mean, you could do it for free on YouTube, really. You could just, I don't know that I would be spending that much in dollars to a product company. I would be spending dollars on salary time to spend time learning and go through the design process that way.
Okay.
That's a great answer, but that's how I would approach it.
So that would be, we can call that your first priority. But what about if the DevOps team is saying, hey, Dan, we think after we took your training or your focus on training, we think we should add some of these AppSec tools into our pipelines, but we're not sure which ones that we should start with. So if you had to give us like priority 2 and priority 3 that came from the tooling suites, what would be the first 2 categories of tools that you would add in for this company?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, the way people build today, I would probably grab an SCA product so that I could make sure that the packages that we're pulling in, that we have some understanding of what's coming into our project. So I would probably look at an SCA tool off the bat, and generally, again, this kind of depends on what language you're using and all that stuff. But the next thing would probably be a SAST. I would probably, especially if I'm that early, I would want to be making sure we're monitoring the code as closely as possible. And that doesn't necessarily mean like a Fortify. I would probably avoid a big, huge package like a Fortify. I would try to look at some of the smaller vendors that are specializing in the language that I'm working in.
Yeah.
Because I don't have the large company problems at that point, right? When you're a large company, you have all these different program teams writing in code in different languages. Your choices are going to be different than if you're a small startup with like one code base. And so I would be operating on like, this is one code base. Let's focus on this for now and try to keep my spend down.
Mm-hmm.
All right. Switching a little bit on some other tools. What are your thoughts about Dast? And this is sort of a loaded question for Chris, but curious to see your take on Dast.
I didn't know that you started a Dast vendor before I added that question into the mix. So, you know.
Oh, I thought that was the intention. I thought you wanted
I can't wait for this
to beat my own kid up. Really. Okay. So, well, one, I've spent nearly 20 years building Dast, right? And building Dast products. So I do think I really do like Dast within what they are able to do. Right. The over expectation tends to be the biggest problem. But I think the nice thing about Dast is that you are able to get a comprehensive like understanding of the application that is actually running. Sometimes when you're looking at code, you're looking at a bunch of stuff that isn't even necessarily executed, right? There's all these different challenges. But with a Dast, you're dealing with the running applications and you could test things for real. So the Dast, and I can, this could be its whole, like we could have a whole episode on just the Dast, and I had a video on it too, but it's able to look at things in some ways a lot better because you're dealing with a real application. The challenge that it has is that it doesn't understand context. And so, it could be clicking on different pages, but if it's like looping through an inventory list, it could go on infinitely, right? Because it doesn't understand the context, doesn't understand that I'm just, yes, the URL changes, it's a different page, but is it really a new content? And there's things that we've solved. We've done things to solve that, looking at like what sections of the DOM actually are changing from page to page. And we create these signatures, and we have all these techniques for trying to avoid those infinite loops. But it is like, these are these rabbit holes that Dast is going to go down. And then the other thing is when it's trying to populate like forms with valid looking data, that can be very difficult because it doesn't know what's actually being asked. So there's all these like, and then there's workflows, like even going through a shopping cart. If I see these pages as I'm going through the crawling process, but then I like attack them out of order, right? If I come back later and just like jump right to attacking the billing page and I didn't like add anything to my cart and fill in the shipping page, I can't attack the billing page. It's going to reject me out of hand, right? And so there's all these things that you have to deal with. And that workflow, let's say, is pretty common. So I could write detection and support for that workflow. But the next workflow that's completely custom to the product, how is the Dast going to understand that? So it needs training for those things. I tried to approach the effort of like on the assumption that the user is not going to give me anything more than a URL, maybe credentials. And that's going to be like 98% of the time. That's all I'm going to get. And I have to do a good job. And so we would do a lot. We try to solve a lot, but there's limitations. And then I would say, okay, for those other 2% that are actually going to give me some training data, I would try to make it as easy as possible. Give me any format you have. If you have a Burp Suite log, cool. You have, Paros proxy back in the day. If you have, Zap proxy, whatever you have, if you've got Selenium scripts for your unit tests, anything you can, because from a Dast perspective, it is desperate to understand a little bit more about the application and the actions that users take to be able to do effective testing. So I like them, but I'm very aware of their limitations. I don't know that there's anybody more aware of the limitations of Dast than myself and some of the people on my team. Right.
Let me bounce my the reasons I don't like DAST anymore.
Sure.
And I'd love to get your take as somebody who's thought about this a lot more in depth and built a product around the whole solution. So one of the biggest challenges I have with DAST is DAST is not compatible with DevOps. You can't create a fast enough. You can't do DAST fast enough in a DevOps world, at least not in the pipeline.
100%.
Okay. Because like some people try to, and it's like, Zap did this like 1 minute scan option where like it would try to do as much as it could in 1 minute. I'm like, what does that mean for anything? Like that's just letting somebody check a box if you're doing a 1 minute scan and you're not doing a complete
these scans
operation.
could take a long time. Like we'd have 20-hour plus scans on a regular basis.
Yeah. And so that's another challenge that I see in DAST is that lifetime scanning time. And I just personally, I never had any success with DAST with modern web applications, like with React and Angular front ends, which is anybody that's in the startup world. You're just not building anything that's not using React or Angular as your front end. And so I just had very little success getting any measurable, many actionable data to come out of a DAST. And Robert knows this story, but I was forced to use a DAST as a procurement requirement. And I fought tooth and nail in the procurement process. I'm like, no, you don't understand. I understand pipelines and security. And we're doing SCA. We're doing SAST. We're doing secure code review. We're doing threat modeling. We're doing all of these things. I don't need to run a DAST. Oh, no, you have to have a DAST. If we buy your product, you have to run a DAST. So that's what I had to go out and I looked across a number of different options in the industry and tested them against our React-based front end and Ruby on Rails back end, and none of them provided anything but garbage. And so I'm like, I got to spend money now and set this thing up to run once a week to check a box, because I believe if I agree from a legal perspective, like I agreed to it, I signed the paper, my name was on the paper, I'm like, I'm going to do it. But I'm like, it was frustrating that I wasn't getting any value out of my money. And, Dan, you've been in the startup game as well. Like cash is king, and it's, you don't throw money away. And we were a bootstrap startup. So it's even like every dollar was very important to me because I didn't have $1 million in the bank to do it. And so that's where, some of the origin story of where my dislike of DAST is coming from. But what are your thoughts on that? Like, is there any reality to what I'm saying here, or what do you think?
Oh, totally valid. Totally valid. So it depends on the DAST product you're using as well. So DAST has had a difficult time evolving. Okay. And we tried to stay on that effort. And like, man, most of the DASTs that don't have their founder still, and people that are really passionate about evolving the tech stack, they fall behind. So, I had this conversation with Caleb when he left Spy Dynamics, or HP at that point, right? He was like, when you leave, they're gonna. I'm like, thanks for leaving, because now that product's gone. And he's like, nah, I left him a good roadmap. Like, if you're not there to help make sure that they execute, it's not gonna happen. And sure enough, it's so in the original, like in the earlier days, let's say the early like 2000s to the mid-teens, okay. It was a lot easier to do a DAST because the pages were a lot more static. The client side was not very heavy, right? And so you could crawl very well. You could actually crawl those pages very well and then do the tests, okay? And I remember I think it was 2012, maybe? Yeah, 2012. 2012, there was, I got a phone call on a Friday afternoon, and customer was saying, like, I tried to run the scan, nothing's happening, and what's going on? And so I'm like, okay, well, show me your scan, right? And we were like on GoToMeeting. So I had him spin it up, and he ran a scan. It starts and stops like 30 seconds later, right? So I look at the page myself. I'm like, oh, yeah, it's just an HTML page that's loading a Flash app. And that Flash app is doing all the rest, right? And it's communicating with AMF to some backend. And he's like, okay, so what? I'm like, yeah, you're going to need like a pen test, because a DAS scanner can't do that, right? Like it can't deal with that client side. And we also didn't know how to deal with AMF at that point, right? Like this is a whole different data format. We're used to the name equal value pairs of a get and post. Like that's how the DAS scanners were all built, right? That's all how we were all designed from the ground up. And so he's like, well, what do we do? And I'm like, we got to get a pen tester. He's like, we don't have time. This was the feature of their Super Bowl campaign. This is like PepsiCo, and they had like some stupid like social media thing for this Super Bowl campaign. And so I'm like, okay, well, let me take a look at it. I grabbed Burp, grabbed an AMF decoder, started like parsing the things down, injecting SQL injection into the payload, into it, repackaging it up, sending it off. Sure enough, wide open. I'm getting PHP errors. I'm a good PHP developer. I mentioned that earlier. And so I started I grabbed the AMF PHP library, see how it works. Like, okay, he's just trusting the objects. He just, whatever. Get your developer on the phone. And we ended up going through and fixing it. I showed him I'm like, hey, look at this line of code. You're trusting the data from this object. And he's like, what's happening? And so I show him the errors I'm seeing, and so we went through and fixed it and whatever. But I had to go back to the team and say, hey, like after watching the Super Bowl, got a kick out of it, but it got me thinking, like, DAST is going to die. If we don't redesign all of this, we are going to be obsolete because we couldn't handle the data formats and we couldn't handle the heavy client. And so we actually took a step back, basically redesigned the entire scanner. We separated the data format from the attack payloads because we were starting to like wedge them in. We're like, oh, if we want to support like JSON, every attack module has to get updated. I'm like, this is a nightmare. Let's redesign it. Let's separate it. And we call this like a universal translator. So we had everything would get brought into a standardized object, but that thing knew how to deconstruct and reconstruct every data format. And so we redesigned around that. And so we actually got ahead of the game. We actually could handle AMF. We could handle JSON, XML, we had RPC versions of XML. We had Google Web Toolkit when it came out and it had its weird pipe delimited format. We would add in support for all these different data formats. So that solved a big piece of it. That got us a long way, like when we got acquired into Rapid7 and we were kind of doing things. But then client side, React. All of a sudden now the client is so heavy, and like React in particular threw us off at first because we had a model where we would actually grab the DOM or load up the web page, put it in a real browser object, and then go through all of the elements that have events on them and trigger the event and see what would happen. We did that on a React page, and there was like nothing had events. There was just one event on the document, right? And they had this shadow DOM. So then we had to go figure out like, what the hell does this do? And so like if we go learn the shadow DOM and we learned how to like translate it back to the real DOM elements and then trigger them again. And so we could start getting somewhere. But we started having to do that for every framework. And then, React changed its shadow DOM and then we had to go and try to catch up with that. But we were so like constantly behind because it's a difficult problem when you like, until there's enough adoption for it to become a problem that's worth investing development time into resolving, we wouldn't do it, right? And so you're constantly like trying to figure that out. But by the time then you go, oh, well, now it's gotten so big, everybody's using it, and now we got to try to catch up. And so I don't know the timeline of when you needed that, but you probably were dealing with the DAST that hadn't figured out how to deal with React yet. And it was basically pointless for you, right? It's like almost doing nothing. So totally valid, and I don't know if that shed some light on the actual design challenges.
It does, definitely.
But also your use case is wrong for DAST. Okay? In your model, I'm not sure I would be prioritizing a DAST. Now, maybe doing a DAST, maybe doing a one-off here and there just to like give it a final sanity check would have made sense. So even if you would have like, done a once a year, you do a $2,000 scan from from Rapid7 or NetSparker, right? Or Invicti, right? You can do a SaaS offering version of that, run it once a year or something would probably make sense just to give you some extra sanity check, but it's not going to work in your pipeline very well. Especially if you're doing React or you're doing a lot of like really modern UI design, you're going to constantly outpace the scanners.
Yeah. So is this why we've seen the modern kind of API scanners have become kind of its own class of technology, and sometimes people put those with DAST together. But are companies focusing on just scanning API because of the complexity? of
Yes,
keeping
they're
up
trying
with
to
the front
avoid
end?
they're trying to avoid the client side
Okay.
complexity. And they're also, so like we changed to handle all these different data formats. Okay. So we can handle the APIs fine, but now you have a new problem. Discovery on APIs is an entirely different beast. Because now you're trying to beg somebody for a Swagger doc or Open API doc or some way to understand how that API is done. If they don't do, GraphQL at least has its own its own introspection, which helps. But if you don't have that, you're hitting an endpoint that tells you nothing. It gives you nothing to work from. Are you able to hear me now? Right? Sorry.
Yeah, I can hear you. I think Robert's having some
Okay.
difficulties here.
So if you're dealing with an API, you have nothing to work from, right? You're at a ground level, can't do anything. So when you're in that situation, they're building other stuff. They're building other tooling to help deal with discovery, and so that's what they're kind of focused on. And that's that's a fine problem. We tried to do both, and we were doing more and more at Rapid7. But it was definitely an evolution. Trying to handle both is very difficult. We had at least a big enough team so we could, but it's a tough challenge. Let me go back to another thing. I said your use case was wrong. Imagine you're a different kind of user now. You're in a large organization, and this is a lot of our customers. Okay, they're in bigger organizations. I talk to these IT guys, and these security guys, and they have no idea how many apps they even have. Right? They've got hundreds, thousands in some cases. Their difficulty is even just discovering them. And then, but they need to go and run a scan to see if there's any problem across the org, right? What other tool can you point and shoot at all these environments without having to engage with every dev team and trying to that would be endless if you've got 2,000 apps trying to engage with every team, getting a dev environment set up so you could run a test or run their static analysis, all that. That's not going to happen. So you could take that list, feed it into a DAS scanner, have it run all those thousands of scans over a month or whatever it's going to be. You get some results. And if there's anything important, then you engage on a case-by-case basis, right? That's a better use case for, than your single application that you're trying to get into a DevOps. It's the wrong tool for the job.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Hey, Dan, let's take a look at what we have. We've been doing for a few of these podcasts, a lightning round. So we have some questions to ask you. What is your most controversial take on application security?
Well, what controversial? I don't know. I mean, I think the idea that all the products suck was a fairly controversial take.
Yep. I'd say so.
Across the board, they all suck, right? and I even included not just products but services like pen testing and bug bounties, right? And the good and bad of them both. But I do think that on some level, they all have a problem, and that problem is not generally being honestly assessed and honestly talked about. Everybody wants to talk about why their solution is better than all the rest, and not being open about the strengths and weaknesses across the board. So I would say that's probably the most controversial because it's created a lot of conversation, and it's been a fun series.
Bet. So second question, what would it say if you could put a single message on a billboard ad inside of the RSA or Black Hat conference?
Man, I think that the legacy vendors should be watching their back because there is going to be some innovation in this space. People are coming. There are a bunch of startups trying to solve this differently, looking at it fresh. And so if I had some kind of billboard and I can express have a little crowd of legacy vendors and they're getting old, they're getting ready to get shoved off a cliff because some of these startups are going to be coming for them and they're not going to be ready for it. And so I would say, watch your back.
Cool. And then third question, what's the most recommended security book that you can give to us or recommend?
Oh man. Oh gosh, what was it? Is it David McGraw? His one, maybe not a security book, but I think far too many people have lost the art of understanding TCP/IP, and really, so like there's like the TCP/IP Unleashed, and then there's like McGraw's like input injection book. Gary McGraw. Gary McGraw.
Gary.
Yeah, Gary McGraw's book on, and I don't remember the title. I mean, I wasn't prepared for this one, but there's a couple of those old school books that I still think are some of the best at really opening your eyes to like how this stuff is all put together.
Do you remember TCP/IP Illustrated?
That's the one. I said Unleashed, but Illustrated.
Yeah, the white. You had the white cover. Yeah, it was 2 volumes. I think I've got it on my shelf in my closet.
I have it in the garage. Yeah, exactly.
It's
That's
an
what
old
I'm
book.
thinking of.
It's old though. That was like 90s, late 90s, I think, when that came out, or maybe even a little earlier.
But people these days often don't understand how this is actually all put together, and I think they're missing fundamental like building block knowledge, and they're just jumping in on the top of layer 7 and forgetting all of the other layers that actually make this happen, and that those are also part of the problem. So, I'm an AppSec guy, so I spend most of my time on layer 7, but I feel like it wouldn't be as effective if I didn't know the underpinnings of it. And
I'm with you as well. Like that's a thing. Like when I go to troubleshoot a network problem in the house, the foundational knowledge of how TCP/IP works comes in handy at different times when you're trying to figure out, is this a physical problem? Is it an addressing problem? Is it something else? And that's something that, I'm grateful that I learned that early in my career. I think I was forced to learn it early in my career by the people I was working with. They said, no, you have to understand this. If you don't understand this, you can't even talk to us. So go away, figure it out, learn it. And then we can start talking about security when you understand how things talk to each other. So
yeah, there's much more beyond port 80 and 443. It really is.
Some people's minds are just blown. Right? Like, what? What are you talking about? There's more
What's port 80.
DNS doesn't use port 80. All right. So Dan, from a kind of a key takeaway perspective, we always like our guests to leave our audience with something actionable. Like what can people do as a result of all the things that we've talked about today, other than read TCP/IP Illustrated? I'll take that one off the board. But what, from your perspective, like what homework do you want to assign? What's your key takeaway for this audience?
I think, again, maybe I'll just go back to it, and it's a broken record, but go back and look at all of the tools and start spending some time understanding the strengths and weaknesses, and where these new vendors are trying to solve things a little different. And they're going to have their own strengths and weaknesses. But I think just having that assessment, like, am I even using the right tools for my problem? Go back and ask that question. Don't just assume like, oh, everybody uses a SAST or everybody uses an SCA. Like, is that even the right tool for your challenge? And so I would want everybody to go and assess that.
Very cool. Well, Dan, thanks for sharing your insights and your wisdom over a long career in the field of cybersecurity that kind of led into AppSec as well. And it was great to hear you use all those terms that are stored in the back of my brain somewhere that get it brought out when we start talking about the past like we did. But I enjoyed just getting your perspective on the AppSec industry, the products. You gave me some things to think about with DAST. I might have to consider how I revise my my conclusion, because I think you gave me some stuff to think about, though, about DAST in an enterprise is different than DAST in a startup. So most definitely. But we appreciate you being here, and keep up the good work with your series that you got going on, and we'll continue to listen in as well.
Thanks. It's been fantastic for me, and thanks, Robert and Chris, for having me on.